on the mountain, says the dumb got dumb. Hellfire and brimstone, swap for oil and guns. When we're pushing up daisies, we all look the same. In the name of the Father, maybe, but not in my name. On this Jacob's ladder, the only way up is down. One step from disaster, two to make the higher ground. Jacob's ladder.
And I sent him to the wars to be slain, to be slain. And I sent him to the wars to be slain.
A million lifetimes left dying in the sun. In the streets down in Whitehall, dogs picking at the bones. 9/11 got branded, 9/11 got sold. And there'll be no one left to water all the seeds you sowed. On this Jacob's ladder, the only way up is down. One step from disaster, two to make the higher ground. Jacob's ladder.
And I sent him to the wars to be slain, to be slain. And I sent him to the wars to be slain.
And they sent him to the wars to be slain, to be slain. And they sent him to the wars to be slain.
Please join me in giving a good round of applause to Frank Lindh.
I appreciate your attention tonight to the story about my son, John. This is John's hometown, San Anselmo. I've been asked to do this lecture at various places as far away as London and New York, and many universities around the country, but this is the first time I've been asked to speak in San Anselmo, so here I am in John's hometown. They say you can't be a prophet in your hometown, but we'll see if we can prove that wrong. So I'd like to say my goals tonight are just really to explain the facts of John's case, and then based on those facts to have you think about what happened, and to think about this proposition that the rule of law, the thing that we live by, the Constitution, the rule of law, all the things that go with that, the right of due process, the presumption of innocence, all the precious rights that we have under the Constitution, how fragile they are and how quickly they can be forgotten in a time of distress, as we had after 9/11. And John's story, it's a story of a boy from San Anselmo, brings that to life, I think, in a unique way. There's a wonderful case involving a young man like John who was picked up in Afghanistan named Yasser Hamdi, and went to the United States Supreme Court eventually. He had a very courageous public defender who took the case all the way to the Supreme Court and prevailed, and they held that this young man was entitled to a hearing before he could be declared an enemy combatant. And after that, the government, rather than do that, rather than conduct such a hearing, they simply sent him home to his family in Saudi Arabia. But Justice O'Connor, the Supreme Court Justice, wrote the plurality opinion in that case, and there's this wonderful statement she says about the values that this country holds dear. It is during our most challenging and uncertain moments that our nation's commitment to due process is most severely tested, and it is in those times that we must preserve our commitment at home to the principles for which we fight abroad. It's a wonderful statement by a great justice, the first woman justice on the Supreme Court. So let me start with John's story, the story of John. John, as David said, is Marilyn and I. He's our second child, number 2. He has an older brother, Connell, a sister, Naomi. He was born in Washington, D.C. in February of 1981, just after John Lennon was killed. And are there any John Lennon fans in the room? He was killed in December of 1980, but just before he was killed, John Lennon released a wonderful album that he had gone silent for a long time, but he released this album that was sort of full of his family life. It was a really upbeat, wonderful album. And then this tragedy happened where he was murdered in New York. But there's a song on that album that captures how I feel about John. It's called Beautiful Boy. Beautiful, beautiful boy. It's a little a sweet little a lullaby that he would sing to his son, Sean. Beautiful, beautiful boy. And this is John. These pictures are all taken by Marilyn. He was born in 1981 in D.C. I'm in the way, sorry. Born in Washington, where I was at the time about to start law school, working in the government and went to school at night. And he lived there, we lived there until John was 10 years old. And then we moved here to San Anselmo. He's just a great kid. He always had this kind of a serenity about him. Even as a very small child, he was very alert, but very serene. He had this quiet quality that was kind of unique. I would say our other two kids were more of the fidgety type kids, but John was this quiet one that would just sit in your lap and just watch things as they went by. And later when he discovered Islam, I said, John, I feel like you've always been a Muslim. You've always had that center. You just needed to discover Islam. And he agrees with me. So he's raised Catholic. I'm a practicing Catholic. I go to St. Raphael's Church. I used to take John to St. Anselm's Church here in San Anselmo. And he's baptized Catholic, both of my kids. Oh, let me go back. That's my graduation from Georgetown Law School in D.C. That's John in my arms and Connell standing at my feet. Happy day. That was 1985. I better pick up the pace here a little bit. These are some teenage pictures of John. Once again, I might be in the way. Marilyn took all of these pictures. He's a really gifted photographer. So then John's story. Okay, he gets to be just about 12 years old. He went to see the movie Malcolm X by Spike Lee. And he was very moved by the scene at the end of that movie of the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. And in that scene, John was just taken by the fact that there were thousands and thousands, literally millions of people who do this pilgrimage every year in perfect humility and obedience to God. And John was very moved by that scene as a 12-year-old. And up until that time, like most of us, he had never heard of Islam. He knew nothing of Islam, nothing at all. But he began to explore it. In the early days of the internet, John started doing his own research and began exploring Islam without really telling me or Marilyn. He was just doing this on his own. And at age 16, he got on his bicycle from here in San Anselmo, went over the hill to Mill Valley. He'd been studying Islam now quietly for 4 years, went into the mosque in Mill Valley and asked to convert. And he went in and converted to Islam. And the way you convert to Islam, it's a refreshingly simple religion compared to my religion. The Catholic religion is very complex and has layers and layers of various beliefs and rituals and things. But the Islamic religion is very simple, and that's what appealed to John. And when you convert to Islam, you say these simple statements. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And with those words, you accept Islam and you become a Muslim. So John did that in Mill Valley, and then told us, Marilyn and me, later, after the fact, that he had done that and become a Muslim. And honestly, I've never had a problem or a concern about that. I love Islam. I respect Islam. I respect John's conversion. It's a wonderful thing for John. It drew John out. It drew kind of an inner nature out of John that had always been there to begin with. So I've always viewed it as a completely benign thing for my son to be a Muslim, even as I am a Christian and a Catholic. So then he began to get serious about his study. In the Catholic religion, it used to be in the old days, to be a scholar, you had to learn the Latin language, and the priests all studied Latin. Well, in Islam, it's still the case that to become a scholar, you have to study Arabic. You have to master the Arabic language. And indeed, in Islam, the holy book, the Quran, it must be read, it must be memorized in the original Arabic. It is translated, but for a true scholar, the true Muslim scholar will always want to read and memorize the Quran in its original Arabic. So John wanted to learn Arabic, and so at age 16, he convinced me and Marilyn to let him go to Yemen to enroll in an Arabic language school there in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, to become fluent. And Yemen is the place, or was certainly at the time, the place to go if you want to become fluent in Arabic. It is just a little itinerary. John's itineraries overseas. I took him to Ireland. My mother is from Ireland, and I had never been there. So in 1998, when John was 16, we took a trip to Ireland to visit my mother's little village where she had come from, had a nice visit to Ireland. And I do have a picture in here, I think, of John in Ireland, and he used to dress in his traditional Muslim outfit, even walking around here in the streets of San Anselmo. He really stood out. He was unique, but he was not embarrassed about it. He just dressed like a traditional Muslim, and he went to Ireland that way. And I kidded him. These little kids came up to us, in Dublin. The first night we were there, we were getting dinner, and these little kids came up, and the one says, what are you? And the other one says, are you in a play? He said, no, he's a Muslim. I said, John, I don't think they've ever seen a Muslim on the island of Ireland before. In fact, there are Muslims in Ireland. We visited a mosque there in Dublin. The kids were so cute, and the Irish people are extremely warm, especially all my family there, my cousins, my mother's cousins. I'll take questions at the end too, so feel free to ask questions when we get finished. So then John went to Yemen to commence his study of Arabic. He left at age 16, off he went, age 17, right, Marilyn? To Yemen to study Arabic. He was there for, these are my times, July of 98 till May of 99, so not quite a full year when his visa expired, so he had to come home. And then he was home for that entire summer until the early part of 2000. February of 2000, we took him back to San Francisco Airport, and off he went again to Yemen with a new visa to resume his studies. He was frustrated, frankly, when he was home here because it was interrupting his fluency, his desire to become fluent in Arabic. Arabic is a very difficult language to study. It's not an Indo-European language. It's a Semitic language, so it has almost no relationship to English or to the Western languages. It's an extremely challenging language to learn. So he was frustrated that this visa situation came along and he had to be home for that summer, but of course we were happy to have him home for that period. But he went back in November of 2000, just before his 19th birthday. And then he spent those next months in Sana'a again, studying Arabic and studying Islam, studying the Quran and the holy teachings of Islam. And then again his visa expired, but this time he was determined not to come home again and interrupt those studies, so he asked me, and I gave him my blessing, to go to Pakistan, to enroll in a Quran memorization school called a madrasa in Pakistan. And then he went to Pakistan in November of 2000, toured around the country with a man he had met here in the Bay Area, and then found a mosque that he felt suited him outside of a small city called Banu, way up in the northwest frontier. I'm glad John got to see these countries at that time because war has come since then to Yemen, to Pakistan. Those are not peaceful countries today. They were relatively peaceful at the time John went there, so he got to experience these countries before they were disrupted with war and while it was still safe for him to be there. And I have to say, we were always in regular contact, John's mom and John and me and John, through email. He would go to cafes and write us, and he loved what he was doing there. You might say he went native. He spoke the language, he adopted the culture, he adopted the religion, he had already done that, and he was really like a native person. I don't think people recognized him as an American even in these countries. And he was very, very happy. He was very happy with his studies because he was pursuing the thing that he loved, which was Islam, and still is Islam, getting to its core. He's always had that quality of wanting to get to the heart of whatever it is he's interested in. So there he was in Pakistan doing Quran memorization, and the tradition in Islam for a scholar is that you literally memorize the entire Quran, all the verses of the Quran, you commit to memory. It takes years of focused study, and Pakistan is where they developed this technique several hundred years ago of Quran memorization. So that was John's pursuit, and that for him is sort of a building block, a prerequisite for becoming a scholar in the Islamic tradition, is you have to memorize that Quran. So that was his mission, that was his purpose in Pakistan. Then the story has a change, and here's where John starts to get himself in trouble. Let me go through a few more pictures. This is what's on the border between Northern Ireland and Donegal, and that's how John looked going to Ireland. This is about 40 miles east of my mother's home. And I love this picture Marilyn took during that summer while John was home. You can see the affection between John and Naomi. Naomi is 8 years younger than John. And you might have thought when a little baby sister came along, 8 years along, John's 8 years old, that he might have wanted to put her away or get rid of her or something, but it's quite the opposite. He took her under his wing from the beginning. They've always had this extremely close, wonderful, sweet relationship, and I think this photograph captures it so nicely. This is a picture of John. He's got this kind of quirky humor. He has a very wry sense of humor, great sense of humor. It's persistent. All the ordeals that John's been through, he still has a great sense of humor. And I think this picture sort of captures it. All right, so now we're going to take a break and talk about the geopolitical context in the part of the world where John found himself. Here's a map. It shows Pakistan and its proximity to Afghanistan. Neither Marilyn nor I ever imagined these things were going to happen. It honestly never crossed our minds that John would leave Pakistan and go into Afghanistan, but he did choose to do that in the spring of the year 2001. The background on Afghanistan, I'm sure most people know, but the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. They occupied the country for a 10-year period. It was a bad thing for the Russians to do. President Reagan made repeated speeches, including his acceptance speech for the Republican nomination when he first ran for president, decrying the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and praising the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, as he called them, who fought against the Soviets, Muslim fighters. After the Russians left, there was a horrific civil war in Afghanistan. All the warlords had been armed by weapons sent from abroad, including from the United States. And once the Russians pulled out, there was sort of a vacuum, a political vacuum, and these warlords started fighting each other. And the country descended into the most horrific civil war imaginable. There were huge casualties, a huge outflux of refugees who left Afghanistan. Even today, I think Afghanistan, Syria may be catching up, but Afghanistan has had, for more than 20 years, the most refugees in the world. People who simply couldn't stay there and live any longer because the conditions were so bad. Conditions were especially terrible for women. Rape was endemic during this period after the Russian occupancy and during the Civil War. And the United States Department of State publishes a report every year on human rights. It goes back to the time of President Carter, every single year. And in every one of these human rights reports for Afghanistan during this period of the 80s and the 90s, the stories, the accounts of the human rights abuses by these warlords in Afghanistan are all pretty well documented, and they are really, really terrible. We met a cab driver, John's lawyer and I, one time. We're taking a taxi cab in Washington back from the courthouse to the airport, and we had an Afghan cab driver. So we thought, oh, good, we can find out from him about Afghanistan. He was talking about the Taliban. He said, well, at least when the Taliban came, my sister was safe from rape. During the time of the warlords, no woman was safe in Afghanistan. He said during the time of the Taliban, she was at least safe from the crime of rape. That's how deplorable the conditions were in Afghanistan during the period of that civil war. Another background fact I want to emphasize here is that the American government at the time, this was now in the early 2001, President George Walker Bush had been elected, or there was a controversy about the election, but he became the president in January of 2001. And almost immediately, his administration began to supply large amounts of money, very publicly, announcing the grants of money to the Taliban government, which then controlled Afghanistan. We didn't recognize the Taliban at the time as a legitimate government, but we were taking definite public steps in that direction. The New York Times published an article in April, interestingly, just about the same time John chose to go to Afghanistan. And in the article, Secretary of State Colin Powell himself, this, obviously with the full approval of the White House, announced the grant of aid to the Taliban. And the New York Times characterized it as a first cautious step toward reducing the isolation of the Taliban by the Bush government. So these are the background facts. Some of this is lost after 9/11. Many of these facts are lost. This press release was taken down by the State Department from their website after 9/11. But these are the facts. We were friendly with the Taliban, is my point, in the early part of 2001, at the time John made a decision to go there. So we have John now. He's in Pakistan. It's now the spring of 2001. And he sent emails, one to me and one to Marilyn. And he said, to get away from the heat in Bannu in Pakistan, I'm going to go up to the mountains for the summer, so you may not hear from me for a while because there won't be internet cafes. And that was it. That's all he said. And we thought, uh-oh, where's John going to be? The one thing I don't think either of us ever thought was that John was actually going over through the Khyber Pass and into Afghanistan, but that's what his intention was. Now, why did he do that? He went because he had heard these stories of these atrocities that were being committed by the Northern Alliance warlords. The Northern Alliance warlords is a kind of a euphemistic term for a bunch of really brutal warlords who were trying to regain control of the country from the Taliban. They were not supported by the United States. They were supported by Russia, the old occupying country, and by Iran. That's who supported the Northern Alliance, while the Bush administration was putting its money and its support towards the Taliban, the de facto government of Afghanistan. But John went because he thought he could help defend innocent civilians. He didn't tell us the truth. He didn't tell me and Marilyn where he was really going, but he did have that intention, and he thought it was his duty as a Muslim to go and provide military service in defense of innocent civilians. It is, in fact, a precept or a doctrine or a belief of Muslim people that young, able-bodied males, if in proximity to them there's war going on and innocent civilians are being harmed, it's a tenet of Islam that you must, as a duty, you must step forward and provide military service, volunteer for military service to defend the civilian people. And that's what John was, that's the call that he felt that he was answering when he went. Now, he knew enough not to tell me, because I'm sure I would have said, no, you may not do that, John. And I don't know what that would have meant to John, whether he would have disobeyed me or not, but he chose not to tell us what he was doing. Excuse me. But his intentions were good. It was, I would call it a rash and improvident thing to do for a young person to volunteer for military service in a foreign country where we have no particular interest as Americans. It was rash, it was impertinent, it was youthful, it was idealistic. It came from the heart. It came from a good place. But was it a wise decision? I'll leave that with you. Probably not. And any of us made decisions when we were 20 years old that we would look back on today and say, perhaps that wasn't a wise decision. 20-year-old men, 20-year-old boys make decisions that are not always the best decisions. But it certainly came from the right place. It came from the heart. It came from a desire to be helpful, to defend innocent people. And in that spring and summer, he went through military training, just regular infantry training. John, this peaceful kid from San Anselmo, became a soldier in the army of Afghanistan. He had infantry training, he learned how to shoot, he learned how to carry hand grenades, he went through all those basics of military training at a training camp that was funded and openly visited by Osama bin Laden, the terrorist, the man we now define as the terrorist who perpetrated the 9/11 attacks, was living openly in Afghanistan at this time and running these camps as a favor to the Taliban government, to the government of Afghanistan, funding their military training camps. Even as he, in parallel with that, had the secret activity going on to plot the 9/11 attacks. This was his, so to speak, his legitimate front, the thing he was doing openly in Afghanistan at the same time he was secretly planning and training people to carry out these terrible, terrible terrorist attacks that happened later in the year. But John was able to see bin Laden speak. He was able to walk up and meet him at one point in July of 2001. It's an interesting fact. You know, after 9/11 happened, the CIA and other intelligence agencies testified in Congress that, oh, well, there's no way you could get into Afghanistan. No one could get near bin Laden. It's a totally secretive, they used what was the phrase they used about it? It's like a family-based thing, and no one who's not a family member from bin Laden's family could possibly penetrate this network of people, and therefore we didn't drop the ball. We didn't fail the people of America by failing to intercept the 9/11 attacks. It was impossible to meet bin Laden. It was impossible to get to bin Laden. But that's not true. John Lindh, the boy from San Anselmo, saw bin Laden in the summer of 2001 and met bin Laden, spoke words to bin Laden in the summer of 2001. It's a mystery why our own intelligence agencies were so inept in intercepting, because they knew things John didn't know. John didn't know this man was a terrorist. He didn't know he was planning and carrying out attacks and things of that nature. He just saw him as the guy that was funding the military training camp. John did, though, I'll say this. John had skepticism. Once he did hear bin Laden speak, he knew he wasn't authentic. John has this thing about the authentic. He always wants to discover the truth, the real thing. And he knew, in a minute, in a flash, he knew that bin Laden was not a legitimate or authentic Muslim. He knew that. He could tell there was something wrong with this man. But that's it. I mean, he just passes through. That's John's brush with this man, bin Laden. And then he was transported to the front line at the civil war that was going on between the Northern Alliance and the Taliban army up in the most remote part of Afghanistan, in the northeastern province of Tahar. It's a very remote place. John has told me that this is as far as Alexander the Great got in his conquest of Asia was Tahar, right on the border of Tajikistan. So it's like the far end of the world. It's an extremely remote place. And out there in this place, right along the border there with Tajikistan, there was the Northern Alliance Army to the north, being backed by the Russians, and the Taliban army, controlled by the government of Afghanistan, to the south. And it was just this stalemate that had been there for a long time, a line in a war. And John was stationed up there. He never fired his weapon. He did sentry duty. He did cooking. But he was on the front line in a civil war. He was dispatched up there in early September of 2001. There's a scholar named Rohan Gunaratne who is the authority, really the leading authority on Al-Qaeda in the world. You see the cover of his book here called Inside Al-Qaeda. And he later interviewed John at some length for hours and hours. He interviewed John to ascertain on behalf of the court whether John was a terrorist or not a terrorist. And here's his statement to the court back in the United States. Those who, like Mr. Lindh, merely fought the Northern Alliance cannot be deemed terrorists. Their motivation was to serve and to protect suffering Muslims in Afghanistan, not to kill civilians, not to kill civilians. These young men, these soldiers who volunteered their services, they're not terrorists. They're soldiers in an army to defend civilians. That's their whole purpose. This is a character that features in John's story, Abdul Rashid Dostum. He was a former collaborator with the Soviet government. He's a terrible human rights violator up there in northern Afghanistan. He's native Tajik. No, he's not Tajik. He's Uzbek. He's a native Uzbek. Uzbekistan is to the north of this province, a little bit to the west of where John originally went. And this Dostum, this is a quote from the New Yorker magazine, he's viewed by most human rights organizations as among the worst war criminals in the country. He was part of the Soviet government. After the Soviet withdrawal, his troops were notorious. They were mentioned repeatedly in these human rights reports for their atrocities against civilians, rape and killing of prisoners. During the American invasion, after 9/11, the American government in Afghanistan declared that the Geneva Conventions governing the handling and treatment of prisoners of war, which were adopted after the Second World War, would not be followed in Afghanistan. We unilaterally declared that we would not follow these conventions, even though the American government is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, and the Afghan government is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions. And this declaration had a profound effect on the ground in Afghanistan. It was a license to these warlords, in particular Dostum, to kill the prisoners. They didn't have to obey the Geneva Conventions. And the key thing of the Geneva Conventions is you handle prisoners of war humanely. You don't kill them, you don't torture them, you handle them humanely. That's the governing principle. And we really turned these guys loose on these prisoners. As the American invasion happened, we used aerial bombing and so forth to really crush the Taliban army. And when these warlords then swept in, they literally would not take prisoners. They would kill their prisoners. They often would castrate and then kill the prisoners. It's a very chilling series of photographs that appeared in the New York Times of this Taliban prisoner being pulled out of a ditch. And this first picture is him with this horrified look on his face, and the third picture is him after they've castrated and killed him on the ground. It was a very, very brutal situation that these Taliban prisoners faced in the wake of the American invasion. They were put in these cages, and then they were put in these shipping containers and dragged out to the desert by General Dostum in particular, and they were killed in large numbers in a really brutal way. This is a picture taken by Physicians for Human Rights of one of the mass graves that appeared there. This has all occurred in November and December of 2001 in northern Afghanistan. And it was publicized here in the United States. Nothing has ever come of these war crimes. I call them war crimes. They've never been prosecuted, but they certainly occurred. Thousands and thousands of Taliban prisoners were massacred, brutally massacred by the warlords of northern Afghanistan during the period of the American invasion. So here's John's chronology. September 6th, he arrives at the front line. October 4th, after 9/11, roughly a month later, we began aerial bombing. And then later in October, the line broke. The line of the Taliban army out there finally broke because of the American aerial bombing. and the Taliban soldiers grabbed their bags and ran. They literally ran from the front line in a confused retreat, trying to get from the front line a distance of 60 or 70 miles to Kunduz, the capital of Tahar. And John was one of about several hundred Taliban soldiers who got out. I call this his first ordeal. Really, there are 3 ordeals for John. The first ordeal was simply this retreat from the front line. About a third of the soldiers, as they're fleeing, are killed by the pursuing Northern Alliance troops. They don't capture them, they kill them. But John was fortunate to escape to get to Kunduz. That's his first ordeal, this 80-mile trek across the desert with these Northern Alliance in hot pursuit. Then in Kunduz, there was a deal reached with General Dostum between the Taliban commander and Dostum that we will give up our weapons and you will allow us, you Dostum will now allow us to pass through your territory to the west. And then these soldiers were hoping they could get to the western part of Afghanistan and disperse and go home to Pakistan or wherever they might have come from. They were trying to escape from being killed. There's a very powerful cable that was sent. John's lawyers obtained this cable. It was sent from Kunduz by the American consulate to the State Department, to Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, and it said, what are we supposed to do? These prisoners want to surrender to someone who won't kill them. They want to surrender to someone who won't kill them. That was the dilemma the Taliban prisoners faced in November and December of 2001 in northern Afghanistan. But there was no assistance coming from the American government. We were not going to follow the Geneva Conventions. That had been the decision of the government. So John joined this group of about 400 prisoners who surrendered. They didn't surrender to Dostum, but they made a pact. There's a transfer of money. Dostum got some $200,000 of cash from the Taliban commander, and the Taliban prisoners gave up their weapons. They were herded into trucks, and then the trucks were supposed to proceed across this province in north-central Afghanistan to the west. Well, Dostum broke the deal. You don't make a deal with a person like General Dostum. He broke the pact and diverted the trucks into this fortress on the outskirts of a city called Mazar-i Mazar-i Sharif was the center of Islamic learning back before the time of, well, centuries ago. In modern times, it's fallen on hard times, but it has a respected history. And outside of Mazar-i Sharif, there's this old ancient fortress. It's at least 200 or 300 years old. But inside, it kind of reminds me of the Alamo in a way, except it's much bigger on the inside. It's like several football fields big on the inside, but it's a big old walled fortress, and that was Dostum's military headquarters. He diverted the trucks into his fortress, and at that point, the prisoners felt that they knew they had been betrayed, that Dostum was, betrayed the deal, was diverting them, and they were truly afraid of being killed because Dostum had this long history of killing prisoners in his custody. So these 400 or so Taliban prisoners are diverted into this fortress outside of Mazar-i Sharif, and this begins John's second ordeal. John was among the 400. We didn't know any of this at the time. We learned all of this later. So there inside the fortress, it's called Qala-i-Jhangi, which translates to House of War. That's the name of this fortress. And this is a famous battle that occurred in late November of 2001. This is a picture that exists of Dostum with the Taliban commander doing this deal to allow them safe passage. This is at that fortress. This picture is taken. That's the Taliban commander in the center. That's General Dostum to our right. He took the money and then he broke the deal. This is the Qala-i-Jhangi fortress, give you a sense of it. The dimensions of it are quite large. And then on that first morning, Sunday morning, the 25th of November, Dostum's troops were in control of this fortress. There were no American troops there at all, just Dostum's Northern Alliance troops. So it's a dangerous situation. All of these prisoners felt that they were in severe danger. They were, in fact, in really severe danger of being killed by General Dostum as they're inside this fortress. And John was among them, so they began to pull them out individually. Their arms were tied behind their backs at the elbow. And this is John. He's led out to this blanket with his arms tied. He's in desperate fear at this point that if he says anything, if he identifies himself in any way to stand out from the group, that he'll be among the first to be killed. Every one of these Taliban prisoners had this fear, a justified fear of being killed by General Dostum. But there, among Dostum's troops, were two Americans, two CIA men, as it turns out. One is Mike Spann. He's standing to our right. and the other with this kind of a cloak is a guy named Dave Tyson. They're both Americans. They speak with American accents. They don't identify themselves to John, but they proceed to interrogate him. And they threaten him, you're going to die here. And they said words like, you'll spend the rest of your short fucking life here if you don't talk to us. But everything they said just resonated, I think, with John as fear. Like he was afraid of them. He was afraid of Dostum. There were no American troops that he could say, hey, help me, rescue me, take me away, prevent me from being killed. He felt nothing but fear, and justifiably felt it. So shortly, though, so there's a short interrogation, and it's captured. This is a still shot from a video, but their interrogation of John, and they're threatening to kill him. It's all captured on this videotape. And John wouldn't speak. He just stayed silent. He just stayed silent, kneeling on the ground. And then they led him back to the main group, and then the video stops. But just moments after that, just moments later, the Taliban prisoners, these 400, have been kept down in the basement of a building on the grounds there. And they were being let out a few at a time, arms tied behind their backs. They were beating them as they went out. John had his head hit with a rifle butt as he was let out just before this. And after John's interrogation, the last of the prisoners, as they're coming out of the basement, were Uzbeks, like Dostum. And they especially knew how evil he was and how likely it was that they would be killed. So rather than go down easily, they decided to fight. Now, John and all the other guys, there's hundreds of them now, in the courtyard with their arms tied like this, kneeling on the ground. But these last few guys, these Uzbeks, they were tough guys. They were fighters. They grabbed weapons from Dostum's troops and began to fire at Dostum. And then Dostum's troops all throughout the fortress went into panic because right there nearby, this is not a prison, it's his military headquarters. Right nearby is a large stash of weapons, right there. And so Dostum's troops, realizing the situation was that they were losing control of the situation, they just started gunning down all the men, all the Taliban soldiers in that courtyard area, hundreds of them. And John got up with his arms tied behind like that and started to run a few steps and was shot in the leg and fell to the ground with an AK-47 bullet in the thigh. It was so close up that it cut the cord of these are drawstring pants. It went right through the drawstring of his pants and into his thigh. But thank God it didn't hit an artery or a bone, didn't break a bone. And meanwhile, Mike Spann, in that very same moment, this CIA guy was killed. He was killed during the melee by a single shot to the head. He's the first American combat casualty in the Afghan war, is Mike Spann. He's not a soldier, he's a CIA guy, but he's a former United States Marine. And there's a wonderful tribute to him his family has on the website. He left three young children, and his widow said, Mike is a hero, not because of the way he died, but because of the way he lived. It's a strange and terrible irony how John Lindh is there in Afghanistan doing his thing out of his motivation, his idealism. Mike Spann is plucked down in Afghanistan after 9/11. He's doing his thing, also, I'm sure, motivated by idealism. And their paths cross in this fateful moment, this strange and fateful moment. And moments later, Mike Spann is killed and becomes the first combat casualty in the war. It was a terrible thing that happened in this fortress. The largest number of deaths in Afghanistan in the 10 or 11 years of war occurred that day in Afghanistan at the fortress. Dozens and dozens of these prisoners were gunned down. Then there's a fight. Okay, so now the prisoners, not John. John's laying on the ground wounded, and many of them are dead. They were just gunned down in large numbers. But these fighters, these Uzbek guys and a few of the other ones, started to get control of the fortress because they got into the weapons cache that was there. It was just a crazy situation. The prisoners were taking over the fortress now. So Dostum's troops were in a high panic. Well, then they brought in, at that point, they did bring in American Special Forces and British Special Forces to quell this uprising of these prisoners. Now, most of the prisoners were dead, and many of the prisoners, like John, were wounded and harmless. They weren't armed at all. But there were a few in there that were fighting, and they literally fought to the death. From Sunday until about Tuesday of that week, there was inside that fort, there was fighting, a fight to the death, where Dostum, supported by American and British Special Forces, were trying to exterminate the people inside who were trying to fight their way out. And they did. They killed every single one of the Taliban fighters inside the fort. But it took several days. These are just photographs. This was quite a well-documented battle that literally is occurring inside a fortress with the press got there, the TV cameras, the photographs and reporters. They all got to witness this thing. This carnage was unbelievable inside there. At one point, they called in an airstrike, thinking they would bomb inside the fortress, drop a heavy-duty bomb, like a 500-pound bomb, and just simply kill everybody inside, all the Taliban soldiers inside the fortress. But the bomb was misdirected and hit the wall of the fortress and killed, I'm not sure this captures it, but it killed instead of killing the Taliban, it killed some of Dostum's troops. There's a long article about this by Luke Harding, a journalist, a British journalist, and he said they had only one plan to kill all those in the compound. There was no effort to take prisoners. So what happened was the fighters were exterminated by about Tuesday. And then, inside that building where they had been led that first night, all these wounded guys were holed up. John was among them. Somebody came out that first night and helped John get up on his feet in darkness and crawl down back into the basement of that building. And I don't know how many to start with, but at the end of that week, 86 Taliban soldiers were found alive inside the basement of this building. And they spent the entire week there with Dostum and the American Special Forces trying to kill them inside the basement of the building. They dropped hand grenades down, all kinds of incendiary devices. They poured gasoline down and set it on fire. And they were just doing, and they did in fact, there were dead men all over the basement. They kept dying and dying and dying through the week. And John was among those who survived. There were 86 of them that survived this horrible, horrible carnage down inside the basement. They wanted to surrender. At the end of the week, Dostum decided to flood the basement. Dostum and the American troops flooded the basement to drown the soldiers. And then many of them did drown, but 86 survived. And John was among them. And John and all these guys behaved with tremendous courage, tremendous physical courage, an ordeal that is almost unimaginable to stand up to this onslaught through an entire week. They had no food, they had no water, they were starving, they were thirsty, they were wounded. Many of them had bullet wounds like John. John received shrapnel wounds as they dropped these grenades down and so forth. And John kept praying and having the other men pray with him. Pray, pray, pray. You know, he kept them going. He played his own role in keeping them going. It's really quite a heroic thing. There was an American soldier, a sergeant, after this was all over, he said, he was quoted as saying, "Oh, wow, I really admire these men, the courage and the camaraderie, how they stuck together through this ordeal. It was quite amazing what these men went through down in that basement to survive." And John was among them. They spent that week in hell. This is a midweek, a photograph taken midweek. This is the carnage in the courtyard, but that building behind there, where these are Northern Alliance soldiers, the building is called the Pink Building, and that's where these guys are. They're down in the basement of that building, trying to surrender and trying to survive. And they stayed there for the entire week. Luke Harding, his article has a lot of powerful words, but he says, he got inside the fortress at midweek. He said, "We had expected slaughter, but I was unprepared for its hellish scale. The brutality and the killing was unbelievable inside this fortress." And this is a picture of the basement. For the men in the basement, says Luke Harding, it had been a cold, terrifying, and squalid extinction. It was a horrible experience. Most of them died, but not all. 86 survived. One of the survivors was the kid from San Anselmo, John Lindh. And that's John as he was taken out after the flooding in the basement. That's the second ordeal. Here comes the third ordeal. John is brought home to America. The media storm, I call it media storm. It's really the most intense thing I've ever seen. And I realize I'm John's dad, Marilyn's John's mother, but there's never been anything quite like this in the history of the United States when John was found in Afghanistan. There was this fever pitch, this hysterical pitch to the media coverage, fed by politicians, and I'll get to the politicians' statements here in a minute. But the media coverage, I'm sure you remember it. It was unbelievably, it was unbelievably negative and hysterical in tone, and it blanketed the United States in a way that I don't think any story ever has. There's the O.J. Simpson case, maybe Michael Jackson's death, but no, this was on a bigger scale than those things. It was every single television station, every single newspaper, every single news magazine. There was not a single outlet of any kind that didn't cover John's case. with a kind of a hysterical tone that he was a terrorist. He was fighting against America, is what they said. John never fought against Americans. He never fought against Americans. He went to Afghanistan, he did what he did. All he did from the date of the bombing, when the commencement of the bombing, all he did was try to live, try to survive these ordeals that he went through. He never fought Americans. It's simply not true. It's never true. And I'll just give you a sense. These are some photographs taken immediately after he was discovered at the Qala-i-Jhangi fortress. Thank God he lived. He's 20 years old. The CNN had a camera crew there when he was taken out and brought to a military facility, and there was a very humane medic, an army medic, who took good care of John, but as he's administering morphine to John, this really unscrupulous cameraman came, well, not the cameraman, but the reporter with the cameraman, and started filming John and trying to do an interview. And John says, it's literally captured on tape, he says, the guy says, we can help you. And John says, look, you don't have my permission to film me. If you're concerned about my welfare, don't film me. John had presence of mind. This was after 7 days in that basement. He's wounded. He's an AK-47 bullet in his leg. He's got shrapnel wounds. He's suffering from hypothermia and exposure and starvation and thirst. And he has that presence of mind. Don't film me. But the unscrupulous crew kept going. And John's administered morphine and then begins to just answer their questions as he's administered. Thank God he got treatment. And he answered all their questions. And the interview is very interesting because as I saw it, I was gripped by it because it's my boy. But everything he said was exculpatory, as the lawyer would say. It proved he was innocent. He had nothing to do with terrorism. He was a soldier who had gone through these ordeals. He recited what he had been through and what he had done. No trace of terrorism, involvement with terrorism, sympathy for terrorism, not a trace, nothing like that. But nevertheless, this media back here in the United States, they played this interview as if he were a terrorist and he was a traitor to the United States, and he was like a 9/11 guy. That's how this was portrayed on TV. Look everybody, it's one of the 9/11 guys, and he's an American, he's a traitor. He was depicted on all these outlets. This is just a sample, the cover of Newsweek magazine. Well, this is more than spin. This was an organized thing. This is a rag. It's the National Enquirer. America's traitor tells all. And you can almost laugh because, you know, who takes it seriously? But here, look at this. This is the New York Times. Look at the date, December the 11th. That's 3 months after 9/11, right? September, October, November, December. John is now in custody in Afghanistan. And the New York Times publishes, page 1, this article. Do you see that very compelling photograph of Mike Spann's funeral? That's Mike Spann's casket. That's Mike Spann's widow with the baby in her arms at Arlington Cemetery in Washington. And below it, the headline of the story above the fold, and I'm sorry I don't capture the whole story in this picture, one for his country and one against it. One for his country and one against it. This is the most respectable newspaper in the United States, and it was publishing a page 1 above the fold story with this incredibly compelling and emotional photograph saying that John Lindh fought against America. John Lindh fought against America. That's the entire theme that the New York Times went with. From this day forward, John Lindh fought against America. Does anybody read the New York Times? Does anybody here gather their information from the New York Times? Do you rely upon the New York Times to give you truthful information? I do. I subscribe to the New York Times. And you know, if you think you're getting the truth from the New York Times, think again. John Lindh did not fight against America. John's a victim of a horrific situation. And look how the irony is right there on the same page is the story about the massacre of the prisoners in these shipping containers in Afghanistan, the same story that Newsweek magazine reported on. It's right there on the same page, but that's not the story the New York Times uses. They report dutifully, they report about the war crime and the massacre of the prisoners, but they never explain that John is one of those victims. They set John up as the bad guy against Mike Spann, the hero who died. This is the New York Times, and I'm just giving you a flavor of the media coverage. It just went on, and I don't have news clippings from the TV stations, but the TV was just constant. I'm sure you remember it. If you lived in America in December of 2001, you saw John Lindh on TV like every day with all these images. After he was, I would say, rescued by the American troops from Dostum, I thought, but that's when we found out where John was, that he was in Afghanistan, and both Marilyn and I thought, thank God, he's now in safe hands. He's in safe hands. And he even sent us a note through the Red Cross, I'm in safe hands. He used that expression. But what happened was they took him to Camp Rhino. It's a military base in southern Afghanistan the Americans had set up. It was the United States Marine Corps base. And Mike Spann was a former Marine, the CIA guy who was killed. And the Marines there at Camp Rhino took a very vengeful attitude towards John. It's very regrettable. And they mistreated him to the extent that I would call torture. They took John, his wounded condition, he was, as I said it, he was wounded. He had a bullet wound, he had hypothermia, he had shrapnel wounds, he was suffering from starvation. He was very close to dead when they found him. And he got that basic treatment from the medic as they did that interview up in northern Afghanistan. Then they flew him down to Camp Rhino, and at Camp Rhino they took scissors and cut off all of his clothes, and he was naked. And they put him in this shipping container, naked, in the winter, untreated wounds, in an unheated metal shipping container, and kept him there for 3 days and 2 nights, roughly. It's a form of torture. He was bound hand and foot with these plastic restraints that were so severe, the pain was so severe he could hardly stand it. He has permanent marks on his wrists from the plastic restraints. It's a sign of torture. Permanent marking on the body is proof of torture. And a young mother of one of those Marines then, some years later, posted a statement on the internet about this. She says, I remember the phone call I received in the early morning hours from the Marine Corps base Camp Rhino. I got used to the 3 a.m. calls when my son would return from his hunting missions. My son told me they took Lindh on the truck back to Camp Rhino and put him in a shipping container. He also mentioned that Lindh was wounded. I was horrified at this thought. I remember asking him if they took care of his wounds. He laughed and said, no way. Not only did the Marines at Camp Rhino place Lindh in a shipping container, they taunted him. He was kept in there naked, with no food or blanket. He was sprayed with water. And at night, when it got down to less than 20 degrees, he was left alone to freeze. He cried out to his captors, but his cries went unanswered. He was being punished, not for necessarily taking up arms against the Americans, but because the Marines felt he was a traitor who left America to become a Muslim. He was their age, 20 years old, the same as my son and most of the others who were there. They hated him very deeply and could not, nor would not, show him compassion. I had sent my son a blanket and warm clothing for the cold nights in Afghanistan. When he told me about Lindh, I asked him if he would give him his blanket. He said flatly out, no. The next day, my brain couldn't really process all this information, and I really wished I didn't receive that call. At that moment, I became completely disgusted with the Marine Corps, with what had happened with my son, and with what our country was doing. There was no need for this, John did not have any information that he was trying to conceal. Like, you didn't have to do this to get information from John. He was perfectly willing to talk to the military. This was just brutal mistreatment by our own troops, by the Marines. It's so ironic. My Uncle Joe was a Catholic chaplain in the Navy and served many years with the Marine Corps. And so I have a different take on the Marines than maybe some of you. I've been to Marine bases. Marilyn and my uncle performed our wedding ceremony at Camp Lejeune Marine Base in North Carolina. He served with the Marines in Vietnam. He's a decorated veteran. He died last year at age 94. I do not hate the Marines, but I hate what they did to my boy. This is the metal shipping container, and these are the soldiers, the Marines on the outside. And I can't repeat in a church the kinds of things they were saying to scare John, to frighten him. And after these 2 days, these 2 nights and 3 days, the FBI showed up at Camp Rhino, and they put clothes on John then and brought him inside. And the FBI agent then took a statement, and wrote down his version of what he heard John say. It's an FBI report. And that statement became the basis of the indictment of my son by the government of the United States. I teach law school part-time, and I talk to law students a lot. I say, these facts are so extreme. We have the Fifth Amendment, it's the right against self-incrimination. We have the Fourth Amendment, the right against unreasonable searches and seizures. And we also have this doctrine in the courts, that in the federal courts, it's a wonderful doctrine. It's called the fruit of the poisonous tree. The prosecutors are not allowed to use tainted evidence in court, evidence that's been extracted against the Constitution. And these facts are so extreme that these statements that John made to the FBI man could never be admitted, I wouldn't think, would you? Be admitted as evidence against John in a court of the United States after all that he went through? This is extraction of evidence by torture, really. But it was, in fact, the entire basis of the government's case against my son was that statement taken by the FBI man at Camp Rhino. After that, after he talked to the FBI man, then the torture ceased. Then they put clothes, they let him wear clothes, and they transported him to a Navy ship. And then the guys on the Navy ship were kind of horrified. There's been reports, Brosnahan, John's lawyer, James Brosnahan, got these guys to talk. They were horrified at what they saw. As John is led, he couldn't even walk. He was in such bad condition after all of this. And they left that wound, they left that bullet in the wound during the time at Camp Rhino. The military medic, the doctor rather, on the Navy ship, who later removed it, said the bullet wound was festering and untreated. They left it festering and untreated while they put him through that ordeal. And they're right there at Camp Rhino. Of course, there are medical facilities. If a Marine gets wounded, don't you think there are medical facilities to remove bullets from the Marine? Of course there are. Why did they do that? Why did they do that? I don't know why they did it, but I will say this. John's lawyers obtained from the government a memorandum in which Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, ordered, he used the expression, I had it on an earlier slide, take the gloves off in your questioning of John Lindh. That's the Secretary of Defense's instructions to his military commanders, right down the line to those Marines. Take the gloves off in your treatment of John Lindh. This is an order from the Secretary of Defense. So this is not like random frat boy behavior by these Marines. This is all going on pursuant to the order of the Secretary of Defense, which is in writing that John's lawyers obtained. Okay, I got more. These are the prejudicial statements by government officials that occurred in John's case. And again, this is only a sampling of what we all went through in our family at this time. This is the President of the United States. They kept calling John Walker. John's name is John Philip Walker Lindh. Marilyn's last name is Walker. All of our kids have Walker in their middle names. Connell, Tone, Walker Lindh, John Philip Walker Lindh, Naomi Allison Walker Lindh. But for some reason at the beginning, they all kept calling John Walker. They called him Walker. This is George Walker Bush talking about John Walker Lindh. Different branch of the Walker family, I'm sure. But this is what he says. This is to the American people. And this is only one of many, many statements the president made about John. This is the president of the United States. Obviously, Walker is unique in that he's the first American al-Qaeda fighter that we have captured. Imagine the prejudice to John. Now, John's still in military custody over there in Afghanistan while Bush is making this statement in December. He's an al-Qaeda fighter. The president told us that. Extremely prejudicial and extremely false. Here's Secretary of State Colin Powell. He said that John had brought shame upon his family. This is the same Secretary of State who announced in April of 2001 the grant of the $56 million to the Taliban government. Now he's changed his tune. It's post 9/11, and now he's saying my son brought shame upon his family by serving in the Taliban army. This is the former President Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. This is on Good Morning America with his wife Barbara sitting right next to him. He's just despicable. I thought of a unique penalty. Make him leave his hair the way it is and his face as dirty as it is, and let him go wandering around this country and see what kind of sympathy he would get. The former president of the United States is speaking about an American citizen. And excuse me for saying this, but that is an invitation to a lynch mob. Do you mind if I say that? A lynch mob is an unruly group of citizens who take someone and lynch them. That's what he's saying here. That's the subtext, I believe, of what the president, the former president of our country, is saying about my boy. Lynch him. Dennis Hastert at the time was the Speaker of the House. He called John a terrorist who belonged to an organization that took American lives and came against the American Constitution. Senator McCain, I'd like to take him to ground zero and show him ground zero and see how he feels after that. Recently Secretary of State, at the time Senator Hillary Clinton, on Meet the Press, December the 9th, or the 11th rather. John is a traitor, she's declared. You know, I wish that that Senator Clinton could have only brought herself to say this: let's find out the facts before we make our judgment. Let's find out the facts before we make our judgment. Wouldn't that have been the noble and the constitutional thing to say? Wouldn't that have lived up to our ideals under the Constitution? Wouldn't that have been the right thing to do? Not to call him a traitor. Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of New York, said, when you commit treason against the United States of America, particularly at a time when the U.S. is in peril of attack and further attack, I believe the death penalty is the appropriate remedy to consider. He was talking about John. And indeed, the prejudicial commentary by these officials and the press coverage was so severe that in America, there was an AP, Associated Press poll. And here's the conclusion of the poll. Everybody in America knew John Walker Lindh. Everybody knew his name. And the split was this: Democrats thought he should be imprisoned for the rest of his life, and Republicans thought he should be put to death. That's how it was. That was the poll of the United States. This stuff really had an impact. And this whole while all these things are happening, John is in military custody in Afghanistan and on a Navy ship off the shores of, in the Indian Ocean. And then the Justice Department, Attorney General John Ashcroft held a series, 2 nationally televised press conferences to announce the criminal case against my son. And he made the most outrageously prejudicial statements they're completely unethical. He's a prosecutor. He's the head prosecutor for the government in a criminal case against my son. It's United States versus Lindh. United States versus Lindh. He's the lawyer for the United States. And he uses this bully pulpit of a national televised conference to make these statements about John that are both false and highly inflammatory. It's completely unethical conduct for a prosecutor to do this. We try our cases, that's one of our principles, it's one of our ideals. We try our criminals in courts of law. And the government brings the evidence into the court, and they serve it up, and the jury gets to size up the evidence. That's how it's supposed to work. You're not supposed to prejudice the jury by making these kind of statements outside of court. Even if the statements are true, it's unethical. But if the statements are false as well as inflammatory, then it's just off the charts unethical. In fact, I've heard that Brosnahan, John's lawyer, has told me that they use the videotapes of John Ashcroft's press conferences to do ethics training for federal judges. That's true. That's how bad it was. Let me give you a sample of the things that the Attorney General of the United States said about my son. We cannot overlook attacks when they come on, we cannot overlook attacks on America when they come from United States citizens. A little bit like John McCain and Rudy Giuliani. They kept bringing John to 9/11. That John, in some way, they never could sort of spell it out, but in some way John was responsible for 9/11. And this is just shortly after 9/11, when we all were feeling that grief and the anger about those terrible attacks. Here's another quote. We may never know why he turned his back on our country and our values, but we cannot ignore that he did. Youth is not absolution for treachery, and personal self-discovery is not an excuse to take up arms against one's country. The reasons for his choices may never be fully known to us, but the fact of those choices is clear. Americans who love their country do not dedicate themselves to killing other Americans. And so then we come to the criminal case. That was the announcement of the criminal case. And the case was brought, John was flown back from the Indian Ocean to Dulles Airport outside of Washington so that the jurisdiction of the court in Northern Virginia would attach. And that's where they could put him on trial, 8 miles from the Pentagon, which is one of the 9/11 targets. A very bad jury pool, so to speak, for John in that area. And if I could just give a little flavor, color of what was going on in Washington at those times. We all remember the 9/11 attacks. Marilyn and I and our kids lived in the Washington area for 11 years, so we know it very well. We lived in the Maryland suburbs. This is the Virginia suburbs, but we know the area. We have friends and connections there. Well, in Washington, first the 9/11 attack happened. The Pentagon was one of the targets. The horror of 9/11 I don't need to dwell upon. But after that, at that time in December and January, February of 2002, there was a sniper in the Washington suburbs who was being driven by one guy, and the sniper was hiding in the back of his car. Do you remember this? With a high-powered rifle, randomly killing people with high-powered rifle. randomly gunning people down in like Home Depot parking lots. It was horrible. And it created, among our friends and our family and good people that we know back there, it created this sense of fear that there's these random things happening. And then the third thing that was going on in Washington, I'm trying to recreate the sense of what a jury would look like at that time. The third thing that was happening in Washington in those days were the anthrax attacks. Somebody was mailing this highly toxic substance to members of Congress, and it killed people, postal workers at the old Washington post office. And some of the tainted letters got into the Senate building. The Dirksen office building was completely shut down for a period of months until they could sanitize it from this toxin. This is what was going on in Washington. It was a really, really bad atmosphere to bring John Lindh back and try to give him a trial. And then those statements by Ashcroft and the president and so forth also created this atmosphere. There was no way this kid was going to get a fair trial. I'm just going to skip this, but John Yoo is a famous man now who wrote torture memos on behalf of the Bush government, justifying, and he opined about John's case, but it's interesting, he said, we emphasize that our information about him is very sketchy, but that didn't stop him from doing this long memo about all the things they could do to John, like take away his citizenship and just incredible speculation. But then there's this other email that was released from the Justice Department that really sums the whole case up. At present, we have no knowledge that he did anything other than join the Taliban. They knew that. The government knew that. They knew this kid was not a terrorist. They knew he had nothing to do with 9/11 or Al-Qaeda or any of that stuff. They all knew it, and they made the charges anyway. You see my point? It's not the government believing in its heart that John did something wrong and then making the accusation. They knew it was false. They knew it was false. They knew these charges were false, and they did them anyway. John Ashcroft knew that John was innocent, and he declared him guilty. Donald Rumsfeld knew that John was unarmed when he was found and rescued by the Americans, but he declared that he was found with an AK-47 in his hands. President George Bush knew that John Lindh was not an Al-Qaeda fighter, but he declared it anyway. Where is the Constitution when you're falsely accused? Where are our rights? Well, the key rights are right against self-incrimination, Fifth Amendment, the right against unreasonable searches and seizures, the Fourth Amendment, and then, for me, the big one, the right to a fair trial, the right to a fair trial. That's the Sixth Amendment. And a fair trial means they prove against me. They have to prove that I'm guilty of the crime. That's the essence of the Sixth Amendment. And they have to prove it to an impartial jury, a jury that has not been influenced by outside commentary, that has not been influenced by reading inflammatory material in the newspaper and seeing inflammatory material on television. Is there a jury in the United States that could handle that at this time? No. There was no such thing. The entire country was poisoned against John, the entire country. But the judge decided that none of that mattered, and he would conduct the trial and convene the trial against John to coincide with the first anniversary of 9/11 in Virginia, 8 miles from the Pentagon. That's the case as it was set up. But he had a great lawyer. This James Brosnahan, that's his photograph. He's a famous lawyer in San Francisco, and I had encountered him myself in my professional life. And so when John got in trouble, I thought, Brosnahan can handle this case. He's got the courage, he's got the integrity, and thank God he did. He took the case. His firm wanted to throw him out of the firm for taking the case in December. This is Morrison & Foerster. It's a very big, prominent San Francisco firm, and they threatened to throw him out of the firm. So eventually they worked out a compromise where Brosnahan did do the defense, but he agreed not to put the Morrison & Foerster letterhead on any of his documents in the case. So thank God he did it, but shame on Morrison & Foerster. They should be proud to defend a kid like this. That's what we're all about. That's what lawyers are all about. That's what the Constitution is there for. Defend the innocent against a false attack. But nevertheless, he had a great, great lawyer, thank God, and a whole team, really. Brosnahan brought a team of these Morrison & Foerster lawyers to John's defense. And, well, these are the essence of his defense. He went to Afghanistan long before 9/11, only with the intention of helping defend against attacks on civilians. He never fought against America. He had no involvement, ever, no involvement with terrorism, no sympathy for terrorism, no connection with terrorism. John is the farthest thing from a terrorist you can imagine. He's a peaceful person. Yes, he volunteered to be in an army, but he was doing that to defend innocent people against terrorist-type attacks. He's not a terrorist. And then the criminal case was built on torture, innuendo, and these extremely prejudicial statements by the government officials. It's never been, I tell this to the law students, there has never been a case quite like this in the history of the Republic. In the history of the American Republic, never before has there been a criminal case in which the president, the vice president, the secretary of defense, the senator from New York, the senator from Arizona, all these people have declared the defendant guilty before he's even brought to court. There's never been a case. The attorney general, there's nothing like this in our history. It's an extreme, extreme case of prejudice. Now, how did John get out of this? It's almost miraculous that he got away with his life. Remember, most people, at least most Republicans, wanted to put him to death. To death. He was charged, though, with a whole bunch of counts, including terrorism, but he was not charged with a death penalty crime. He was charged, however, with enough crimes to put him in prison for multiple life terms. And then the government's case collapsed at midsummer. Strange, strange occurrence. And why did it happen? It happened because John's lawyers were going to present evidence about the torture and the abuse that John suffered at Camp Rhino. They were calling the Marines to come to court. And some of them were prepared to testify honestly to what they had seen happen. And the government, Secretary Rumsfeld especially, was very sensitive about stripping people naked and torturing them. He was very sensitive about that. He did not want that on national television in the summer of 2002. So even though they could have railroaded John into all those life sentences, the government offered a plea bargain in July. If you call off that hearing on the torture, we'll give you a plea deal. And they negotiated through the weekend, right before the hearing was to begin. The original demand from the Justice Department, and I almost wept when I heard it, was you have to agree that you provided services to Al-Qaeda. You provided services to Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organization, and 20 years of imprisonment. It wasn't true. John never heard of Al-Qaeda, he never helped Al-Qaeda, he never provided any service to Al-Qaeda whatsoever. So guess what John did? He said no. John is the most honest person you would ever imagine. He would not agree to a plea bargain that was not true. He would not agree. He would risk a life term. He would go to prison for the rest of his life rather than agree to a charge that he helped Al-Qaeda, an organization he had nothing to do with, that he didn't even know about. And so the government backed down. In the course of that weekend, they threw in the towel and they said, okay, not Al-Qaeda, you provided your services to the Taliban, and that violated the economic sanctions that we have against the Taliban. And John agreed to that. Well, he did help the Taliban government, and we did, in fact, President Clinton had imposed economic sanctions on the Taliban. So that's the plea bargain. John agreed he violated economic sanctions after all this terrorism. I call it the T word. Terrorism, terrorism, traitor, traitor. All those charges were pressed against John. None of them were true. They're all dropped at the end. And then what does the prosecutor do in the plea bargains announced? He goes right out in front of the courthouse and he says, he's a terrorist. He's a terrorist. That was the lead prosecutor on the case. And Ashcroft kept doing that. And then Gonzalez became the attorney general, and he kept referring to my son as a convicted terrorist. And every time, and I worked in the Department of Justice. I love the Department of Justice. I'm proud of my service in the United States Department of Justice. It's a great institution, it really is. And these guys are desecrating a great institution by doing this kind of thing. So I'm like Mr. Good Citizen, I write a letter. Dear Mr. Attorney General, the statement you made about my son is false, and it's very dangerous to my son, by the way. He's a prisoner of the government, and you're saying he's a terrorist. Please retract your statement. Do you think I ever got an answer to any of those letters? No. Didn't happen. Eric Holder is now the Attorney General of the United States, and last year, in March of 2012, he made a speech at the Northwestern Law School. They must have the same speechwriters working for him who worked for Ashcroft and Gonzalez, and he said that John Lindh was a convicted terrorist. It's very discouraging. So I wrote him a letter. Dear Mr. Holder, it's not true, it's dangerous, please don't say it, please retract it. No reply, no statement back. John cannot get the kid can't get a fair break. They dropped the terrorism charges, expressly dropped them in the court plea bargain, and they still call him a terrorist. And the judge was very hostile towards John, but he really put the prosecutors through their paces, and then finally said, okay, I'm convinced he really is not a terrorist. So therefore, I will approve the plea bargain and sentence this kid to 20 years of imprisonment. So that's the deal. John, they drop all the serious charges, but John agrees to serve 20 years of imprisonment. And then in October of 2002, I'm almost at the end, I'm sorry I'm running long, John did a statement for the court. This was literally his only time to speak. This is John's one and only time to speak before they shut him away in a prison and put a gag order on him. And he made a very powerful, very, very emotional statement in a courtroom about the size of this church, with Brosnahan standing at his side. And he said a lot of profound things, but the one thing he said I capture here is, I condemn terrorism on every level, unequivocally. Terrorism is never justified. I have never supported terrorism in any form, and never would. That's John, that's my son. He's never supported terrorism in any form, and never would. He's the same kid he was when he left here, when he left San Anselmo, and went through this series of ordeals. He has the same values that I have. He was raised with those values. He carries those values. He incorporates those values in his Islamic belief. He is not a terrorist. He has no sympathy for terrorism. He is an innocent young man. Innocent young man with a good sense of humor, thank God. And he's put up with this ordeal. He's come through it. He's been in prison now for, well, since his prison term commences December 1st, 2011. It's almost 11 and a half years of imprisonment. He's got 6 more years of imprisonment with good behavior until May of 2019. Your government, our government, is keeping this innocent young man in prison for 20 years. Why? I don't know. Why don't you ask them? I cannot fathom it. Why would they do this? I do have a theory. Okay, I can't fathom it, but I have a theory. We failed to prevent the 9/11 attacks. What a horrific, horrific lapse on the part of our government to allow those attacks to happen, to allow those men to take over those airplanes filled with human beings and crash them into buildings. What a failure. Why didn't they stop that? It's an abysmal failure. Then we go to Afghanistan. We invade a foreign country to capture the guy who perpetrated the attacks, and that's bin Laden. And he got away. Now, eventually we tracked him down in recent times, but at the time, in December of 2001, the evil man, the one we're going after, he got away, he escaped. And then they found John. Then they found John. He was convenient. He was a useful person for the Bush administration at a time of abject failure on their part to give the American people something that could be the focal point of their anger and their grief over 9/11. That's the role that John played. And beneath the surface of that, if I may say, is a hatred of Islam. Hatred of Islam by many people in this country who, and you know, they associate, it's understandable on some level, they associate terrorism with Islam. And so they form a hatred of Islam. I don't have that association. I don't think of Islam as a terrorist thing at all. I don't believe those terrorists are authentic, legitimate Muslims at all. A Muslim is a peaceful person. A Muslim would not harm an innocent. A Muslim would not commit suicide. John wrote a wonderful little essay that the judge put into the record in his case, based on his understanding of the Quran. He said a Muslim would never commit suicide. It's against the religion. So these people who claim to be Muslim terrorists are not, I don't think, authentic Muslims at all. But I guess my point is there was some visceral hatred, really visceral hatred, addressed at my son that really worries me and his mother for the day that he does get out of prison. Where will this kid go and be safe? Where will he go to be safe after all of this? Fairfax. There's no mosque in Fairfax. But I want to close with this quote from Judge Learned Hand. He made this speech in 1944, just at the close of near the close of World War II. I often wonder whether we do not rest our hopes too much upon constitutions, upon laws, and upon courts. These are false hopes, believe me, these are false hopes. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. What I've told my students is the Constitution does not live in a vault in the National Archives. The Constitution does not live in a vault in the National Archives. You can go there and see it, but it lives here. It lives in our hearts. And this case of this kid is just an abject rejection of everything that the Constitution stands for. And that completes my prepared remarks. I'm really happy to take questions.
Give him a round of applause.